FM4 Podcast.
Okay, FM4.
As we're coming up to 6 o'clock, we're shifting our focus a bit here now on OK FM4 because tomorrow, on Thursday, the COP28, the 28th United Nations Climate Change Conference, is starting.
Ja, und sie findet in Dubai statt und da fragt sich jetzt vielleicht der ein oder andere von euch, Klimakonferenz in Dubai, wie geht sich denn das aus?
Well, thankfully we have Chris Cummins here to give us the lowdown on everything we need to know before things kick off tomorrow. He has prepped a whole hour of interviews and reports on the upcoming COP. So, Chris, what can we expect from this year's conference?
Oh, well, we can expect controversy, as you've mentioned, a COP in an oil state, and we have a wonderful investigative journalist we're talking to, who is the guy that managed to get his hands on these documents that seem to show that the COP president, Al-Jaber, was secretly doing kind of oil lobbying during meetings which were meant to be about preparing this climate conference, which should be about reducing our dependence on oil. He was trying to sell a bit of oil during his meetings, it seems.
I also saw something about a headline that sort of said that they want to push meat as a sustainable form of nutrition or something along those lines.
Well, we're talking about the hot air and whether the COPs are worth their carbon footprint, to be honest. It's something people say. Greta Thunberg, of course, was famous for going blah, 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 blah. But we're going to take them seriously because they're the best, worst thing we've got, basically. So we're going to talk to people who are going to explain why these COPs are important. Where would we be without the COPs? And why the glacial process, all this discussion of commas and stuff, is actually really important because we believe in consensus. We're not one guy saying what everyone should do, but people coming together and saying, what should we do together? We're going to have to show a bit of patience for the pace.
Du hast ja viele spannende Dinge für uns vorbereitet. Vielleicht so, wenn du jetzt ein Highlight rauspicken müsstest, worauf du dich am meisten freust, was würdest du sagen?
Well, I'm big into fairness. And so we're going to be talking about the north-south divide and finally getting some money to the people who are suffering because we in the rich north have been polluting for decades and decades and decades. There should be some progress. I'm very pleased.
Alles im gelben Bereich. Okay, FM4.
This is a good cop, bad cop story.
Ja, unser Thema in OKFM4 in der nächsten Stunde ist nämlich die COP. Aber jetzt nicht so wie in Polizei, sondern so wie in COP, das heißt nämlich Conference of the Parties und gemeint ist damit die Klimakonferenz der Vereinten Nationen. Da kommen ganz viele Staaten zusammen, um Maßnahmen gegen die Klimakrise zu beschließen, also im Idealfall.
Yes, indeed, but this year's COP, the COP28, is mired in scandal. Leaked documents seem to suggest that the president of this year's COP, Sultan Al-Jaber, has been trying to lobby for lucrative oil and gas deals during meetings with foreign governments about the UN climate summit. So, in other words, instead of concentrating on decarbonisation, he has been trying, allegedly, to profit from selling more carbon stuff.
Ja, was passiert, wenn man einen Vorsitzenden einer staatlichen Ölkompanie zum Vorsitzenden der Klimakonferenz macht? Chris Cummins hat mit dem Journalisten gesprochen, der diese Geschichte aufgedeckt hat.
Our integrated 2030 strategy will unlock and create value from every barrel, delivering the greatest contribution to the UAE and help meet the world's growing energy demand for oil, gas, refined products, and petrochemicals.
That was part of a promotional video for the oil company ADNOC, a state oil company in the United Arab Emirates, promising to increase oil production. Nothing surprising about that, but ADNOC's chief executive, Sultan Al-Jaber, is also the man tasked with the presidency of COP28.
As we prepare to host COP28, we approach this role with humility, a deep sense of responsibility, and a great sense of urgency.
Well, that has all been thrown into severe doubt by research from the Centre for Climate Reporting, led by the investigative journalist Ben Stockton, who's dug up some documents showing what Al-Jaber has apparently been up to in recent months.
What we found out was basically that the COP28 president had planned to use meetings with foreign governments to lobby on oil and gas deals.
Ben worked together with the BBC to verify the authenticity of the documents, which were handed over by a rather brave person.
A whistleblower who I was in touch with came forward with these documents, basically concerned about the direction of COP and about the influence of ADNOC and its influence on the COP28 team. And they shared with me this cache of internal documents and emails and meeting records, which really basically told this incredible story.
So allegedly using the COP process to do some business deals on the side for fossil fuels, something that would mean more fossil fuels, not less.
The real significance of those findings are that there have been a number of conflict of interest concerns around Al-Jaber's presidency ever since he was appointed back in January. This is really like a realization of those concerns.
Mia Moisio is a climate policy expert at New Climate Institute and at Climate Action Tracker. Her job is to examine different countries' climate pledges and look at how realistic they are. The UAE has signed up to the goal of tripling renewable energy capacity, but a look at the figures shows that fossil fuels still rule the roost there.
For example, last year, the national oil company had announced that they would invest $150 billion to expand oil and gas business in the next 5 years. And that compares to, just an announcement to invest $50 billion. So 1/3 of that in renewable energy over the next 7 years. So an even longer time period.
This story has already cast a big shadow over these crucial climate talks. So is the United Arab Emirates now discredited as a COP host?
I do have mixed feelings. I think the UAE could take on, as a major oil and gas producer, it could take on a positive role. It's not as bad or as obstructive in the climate negotiations as some other large oil producers, like, for example, Saudi Arabia. But clearly, it's not progressive enough to get the kind of deal that we need to really limit global warming to 1.5 degrees and give a clear signal that we need to end new fossil fuel investments.
FM4.
There's a lot of skepticism around as thousands of delegates head to Dubai for COP28.
Es ist eine Klimakonferenz in einem der größten Erdölstaaten der Welt. Der Präsident der Konferenz ist der Chef der staatlichen Erdölkompanie. Das passt vielleicht nicht ganz zusammen, wenn wir dran denken, welche wichtigen Entscheidungen die COP oder auf der COP eigentlich beschlossen werden sollten.
Faced with such apparent cynicism, some people might ask, what is even the point of having this climate conference? 70,000 delegates all traveling, presumably many of them flying to Dubai, a massive carbon footprint, and in all probability there will probably be no magic solution at the end of it all.
Ja, deshalb stellen wir jetzt die Frage, warum ist die COP überhaupt wichtig? Ist sie das überhaupt? Dazu hören wir jetzt mehr.
Meet David G. Victor. He's a climate scientist and a professor of public policy who's written books about the United Nations' attempt to contain climate change. Despite their obvious flaws, he insists the annual climate summits are vital.
Because it's the only place where every country can get together, have its voice heard, lay out a general game plan for action on climate change, and feel that that game plan is legitimate.
Because the clock is ticking on efforts to avert catastrophic climate conditions, every day of inaction seems dangerous. And so the long arguments about the wording of climate texts, sometimes over the placement of a particular comma, has led to widespread disillusionment, summed up here by activist Greta Thunberg outside the buildings hosting COP26 in Glasgow.
No more exploitation, no more blah blah blah, no more whatever the fuck they're doing inside there.
And yet, what Greta is criticising is something rather praiseworthy. The COP process is about consensus building, so everyone at the table from around the world gets to have their say and gets to try and influence the wording of the final text. Now that is, of course, a time-consuming process of compromise.
Because every country is there and decisions are made by consensus, the process is glacial. People are constantly talking. It's easy to criticize it as just a blah, blah, blah festival. And to some degree it is. There are these all-night conversations about the placement of commas. And those are important because a country won't agree to the final text unless they're happy with the basic content of it.
N'entends pas d'objection. L'accord de Paris pour le climat est accepté.
A quarter of a century into the COP process, the Paris Agreement of 2015 was a game changer. The one-size-fits-all approach was abandoned. Instead, different countries or political entities got to set their own targets, nationally determined contributions. It got everyone on board.
The Paris Agreement is an umbrella. And under that umbrella, countries make pledges. They update their pledges at least every 5 years. They go off and do things. And most of the real action is not happening in the UN. It's not happening through global committees. Most of the action is happening back at home. It's happening at companies. And that's where facts are really changing. And that wouldn't be occurring but for the knowledge that there's this overall requirement to take climate change seriously and a pretty good framework in the Paris Agreement.
And the COP system has brought real, tangible progress, argues Austria's Renate Christ, who was for 11 years the secretary of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
Zum Beispiel in der Entwicklung der erneuerbaren Energie, in der Entwicklung von Energieeffizienz, Elektroautos und so weiter. Also das wäre alles nicht passiert, hätten wir diese globale Vereinbarung zur Klimaveränderung nicht.
Okay, FM4.
This here is a special hour on OK FM4 dedicated to the UN climate conference that kicks off tomorrow in Dubai. That is the COP28.
Ja, und in dieser Spezialstunde, würde ich sagen, haben wir uns ja schon mit dem Skandal rund um angebliche Öllobbyarbeit bei COP-Treffen befasst. Und wir haben auch schon gehört, warum selbst so eine kritikwürdige Klimakonferenz wichtig ist. Laut Klimaexperten ist die COP28 sogar ein besonders wichtiger Klimagipfel, bei dem es einiges zu beachten gibt.
Of course, something to keep in mind is that because it's a UN event, there's lots of jargon, but the question is, what exactly is going to be on the daily agenda? What is going to be discussed at this year's COP? Chris Cummins is going to help us break it down.
Sarah Louise Nash is packing her bags to travel to Dubai. She's a climate politics expert at the University of Continuing Education in Krems, and she'll be observing COP28. This is what she expects to happen.
There will be lots of talks around global stocktake, so looking at evaluating progress towards climate goals. There'll be a lot of discussions around loss and damage, which have really picked up in the past couple of years. And of course, I'm also expecting really big discussions around whether phasing out fossil fuels can make it into negotiation texts.
We'd better pick those apart. This is the first global stocktake since the Paris Agreement. The German term used is Bestandsaufnahme. But what does it mean? Thomas Sehertner is in Dubai observing the climate summit for the WWF.
Das kann man sich vorstellen wie so eine Art Inventur in Sachen Klimapolitik oder wie so ein globaler Stresstest. Da schaut die Weltgemeinschaft, wo wir stehen am Weg zum 1,5 Grad Limit. Und ich glaube, man kann schon vorab eine Spoilerwarnung rausgeben, wir sind nicht auf Kurs, unsere Klimaziele zu erreichen.
So the easy part was to name the aspirational targets. Now we're going to see the reality. It's as if I swore to cut my cholesterol back in Paris, and after 8 years of continued burger eating, I now have to show people my blood test. And well, let's all prepare ourselves for sobering news.
Es gab letzte Woche einen Bericht der UNO und demnach steuern wir auf eine weltweite Erhitzung von 3 Grad zu. Das heißt, worum es jetzt auf dieser COP geht, ist wirklich nichts zu beschönigen, wirklich eine klare Bestandsaufnahme vorzunehmen und dann eine Kurskorrektur einzuleiten.
Sarah also mentioned loss and damage. That's a mechanism where rich countries who have created most of the historical emissions should give money to poorer countries who have put less carbon into the atmosphere historically but are suffering the worst of the consequences in terms of sea level rise, drought and extreme weather. In the rich north, we look to COP to hear about carbon pledges. In the global south, the transfer of money really matters.
It's understandable, countries in the global south are bearing the biggest burdens from climate impacts, although they have contributed least to the problem. So it's really quite understandable that these issues are key.
It's basically compensation, so why don't we just call it that? Here's climate policy expert David G. Victor.
What we mean is compensation. What we mean in some parlances is reparations. In effect, this is repairing harm that's been done. These terms are highly emotive. And so what typically happens in any global committee or any bureaucracy is you take simple but powerful ideas and you give them complicated names, and then you have endless debates about those names. And that's what you're going to see on display for the next 2 weeks.
It is, of course, easy to be cynical, to mock the COP. But the climate crisis is basically a social crisis on an epic scale. It's a fairness crisis on an epic scale. So excuse the jargon.
You're going to see endless discussions about phase out or phase down fossil fuels. And most of those discussions are shiny objects. They get in the way of reality. But a few of them are really, really important. And this question of what we do with the most vulnerable countries is top of that list.
COP28 on FM4.
We have now reached the final part of our special preview of the COP28, which starts tomorrow in Dubai.
Und zum Abschluss hören wir jetzt von denen, die wohl am besten über Klimakrise Bescheid wissen, nämlich von den Klimaforscherinnen und Klimaforschern.
Of course it is political wrangling, disputes and, as we heard earlier, scandals that have so far dominated the news agenda on this year's UN Climate Summit.
Aber was heißt die COP, die Klimakonferenz, jetzt eigentlich für Wissenschaftlerinnen und Wissenschaftler? Chris Cummins hat versucht, das rauszufinden.
Scientist Twyla Moon monitors the impact of Arctic ice melt in Greenland and beyond. She has provided lots of evidence that not only is the rate of melt increasing exponentially, but also that melt is changing the very chemistry of our oceans, impacting biodiversity and human food stocks, and even changing the ocean circulation systems that have given us a stable climate, as well as causing, of course, sea level rise. In other words, she is providing the warnings that the politicians at COP28 in Dubai should be responding to.
For myself as a scientist, UN COP meetings are a time when I feel that I get to have a sense of how much international decisions are being pushed by scientific realities, but also really the opportunity and agency that this particular moment holds. Actions that we take now will have stronger impacts than if we are to take those same actions in the future.
There are many scientists among the 70,000 delegates gathered in Dubai. Some are observing, some are explaining, and some, as IPCC scientist Ed Byers from EASA explains, are even helping with the negotiations.
There are many scientists who attend COP in support of country delegations, and in particularly least developed countries, small island states, who have typically very small delegations because they don't have resources, but in fact are being supported by some of the best scientists in the world to ensure that the agreements that are taking place are backed up by the latest evidence from the science.
So COP28 can be seen as an opportunity for scientists to use their expertise in a political context. But being present and being actually listened to are two very different things.
Unfortunately, it's a time when I also have felt that the science is not coming together with some of these other information sources in a way that is producing the level of action needed.
So experiencing what happened to the COP can be quite discombobulating for scientists. If you are in Greenland and you've been spotting how your data points to whole areas disappearing under the waves in the foreseeable future, if you can tell people that what's happening might impact the North Atlantic fish stocks, make them collapse, and if you're telling people that the ice is melting so much the planet even might shift its tilt, then it's kind of disheartening to experience the slow pace of progress as countries kind of battle to protect their money-spinning fossil fuel industries.
I definitely feel frustration that the actions are not keeping pace with what science points to our needs in regards to minimizing risk and minimizing damage into the future. Especially because so many of the actions we can take now have really wonderful additional benefits.
Just a reminder, burning less fossil fuels would mean less deadly air pollution, and less deforestation would mean a healthy and life-sustaining ecosystem that looks after us all. We know that, so let's just not claim in the future that the scientists didn't warn us in time.
Okay. FM4. FM4 ORF.at/podcast.